Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it's Saturday. That means it's time for Nitsa Notes, my weekly vlog series about limited magic. This will be our first video about Bloomburrow, the set that's coming out next. My set review for the whole set will begin next Friday, and speaking of which, if you want to gain access to my ongoing notes during preview season, where, my thoughts about the new set are first recorded, or if you want to have access to a spreadsheet with all of my grades on it when preview season is over, you can become a patron or a channel member, and you can find ways to do that in the description. But yeah, in this video, we're early in preview season still. I'm recording this on the Thursday of preview season, and so we haven't seen every single card or anything, but we have seen what all the mechanics are and what all of the two-color combination archetypes are, and I'm going to give you my early thoughts on all of those things, as I always do in this video about a new format that we don't quite have all the cards for just yet. But yeah, the set review will be beginning less than a week from when you're watching this, and then we'll really be diving in. But this is sort of like an appetizer, I guess. So let's go ahead and first talk about the new mechanics, and there are many, although none of them are like completely out of left field. I guess some of them are brand new in some ways, but let's just go ahead and dive in. The first one is Valiant. So Valiant is a lot like Heroic, but it's a little different. So let's read the rules text, which is, as you can see in Heartfire Hero here, whenever Heartfire Hero becomes a target of a spell or ability you control for the first time each turn, put a +1/+1 counter on it. And the Valiant part is that something happens when you target this for the first time in a turn. So it's a lot like Heroic, but it has one downgrade from Heroic and one upgrade. So in terms of what the upgrade is, it's that it doesn't matter how you target it. It can be with an activated ability, doesn't have to be with a spell. So you get value out of any card that has an activated ability more than you would in most decks that target things, even if they're just random target effects. And the set does have those, mixed throughout, so you can trigger Valiant. And this is especially, I'll talk more about it when we look at the archetypes, but this is really what the red-white deck in particular is most into, is targeting its stuff. So you can equip something, you can target it with a combat trick, you can target it with any sort of activated ability, and this will trigger. The downside is you can only do it once a turn. Heroic, you can go off as much as you want. Doesn't work that way here, but obviously this is a mechanic that is largely aggressive. Most of the cards with it are like Heartfire Hero here, where, they get a counter or they do damage to the opponent. You get some kind of effect like that when you trigger it. And so it's a pretty aggressive mechanic overall. And of course, anything that gives you extra bonuses for combat tricks or enchanting a creature or any of that stuff is going to be aggressive too. So it looks like a cool mechanic. It's kind of a new take on Heroic that's sort of limited in some ways, but also more flexible in terms of when it triggers. Another new mechanic is Offspring. So this is an additional cost you can pay when you cast a creature. And if you do, you get a 1/1 token copy of that creature. The idea being that it's its offspring. An example of this is Iridescent Vine Lasher, where it has this offspring for 2 generic. It's basically a kicker that's really specific, and it always makes a 1/1 token copy of the creature. And in this case, you get a copy of this, which is a 1-mana 1/2, but you can also pay 3 and get a 1/2 and a 1/1, and they both have the same text box. They just have different stats. And in this case, if you're getting more landfall, which is what the case is here, that's pretty cool, because this will be pinging your opponent even more, and that's obviously a pretty powerful thing. Some of the cards with Offspring have Enter the Battlefield abilities, so you end up triggering the ETB twice. Some of them are just like extra bodies with a bunch of keywords. They did a lot of different things with it, and it is spread throughout the colors for the most part, but it looks the most focused in like the green, white, and blue, despite the fact that we're looking at a black rare here with it. So yeah, it's a mechanic that is inherently going to make it so you can go wide. A mechanic that's going to result in the format inherently having lots of like 2-for-1 like effects, even though what you're always getting is a 1/1. Oftentimes the 1/1 is worth an extra card, and I think that's kind of the case with the Vine Lasher, because it isn't exactly a card that your opponent can ignore when you have a copy of this creature. Another new mechanic, and I think this one's the most interesting, the most original in a lot of ways, and it's called Gift. So a card with Gift, if it's a permanent, gains an Enter the Battlefield ability where you can choose to give your opponent something. I think most of the gifts are either giving your opponent a fish token that is usually tapped, or giving them a card. So you give them something pretty real, but if you do that, the card gets better. So, example, Parting Gust here is an instant that exiles a non-token creature. If the gift wasn't promised, return that creature to the battlefield under its owner's control with a +1/+1 counter on it at the beginning of the next end step. So this is a really interesting design space, especially on a card like this one, because what you're doing here is making it so this is either a card that you use to blink your own creature and have it come back bigger, or if you choose to give your opponent a 1/1, it just straight up exiles the creature. So yeah, I normally complain about cards, and I'm going to do it to some extent in this format. I complain about cards that are removal that gives my opponent something back, because it kind of means you don't trade 1 for 1, and I do think that's the case here. But it is advantageous that this makes the fish come into play tapped. That means that this kind of removal, which would normally if you have a removal spell that gives your opponent a 2/2 or something, it's horrible in your aggro deck because they can still block or whatever, and still trade even with a 2/2. But it comes into play tapped, and that makes this more attractive to aggro decks than it would otherwise be. So straight up removing something and giving your opponent a random fish, if it means you're smashing in for like 7 or 8, you don't care that much, it's worth giving them a fish. There are some other cards with gift, the ones that give your opponent a card, where you have to do a cost-benefit analysis, because it's kind of like the roll of a dice when it's a card, right? I mean, a card is often not good to give your opponent, but most of the cards that say gift your opponent a card, if you do that, you end up getting another full card of value, so you aren't really falling that far behind. But what you have to think about is the card I'm getting back, example, from your graveyard, there's a card that gives your opponent a card and gets you back an extra permanent from the graveyard. You have to think about how likely it is the extra permanent you're getting back from your graveyard is going to be better than a random card from the top of your opponent's deck. And that kind of cost-benefit analysis is just what you have to do in a game with variants. Most of the time, a permanent from your graveyard, if it's a decent one, is going to be better than a random card from the top of your opponent's deck. But there are going to be times where you have to decide not to do it because the extra permanent you can get isn't that good. And I like those kinds of decisions, and I like the whole tapped fish thing as well. And I think all of these decisions will be pretty interesting, because most of them are on cards that are like kind of okay even if you never gift and then get an upgrade like Parting Gust does when you do gift. So next let's look at Expend, another new mechanic. You can see it here on Brambleguard Veteran, which says, whenever you expend 4, raccoons you control get +1/+1 and gain vigilance until end of turn. So how do you expend? Well, you spend your 4 total mana to cast spells during a turn. That part is a big distinction because you can't do it with activated abilities. It'd be kind of nice if you could, but you can't. You have to cast spells for an expend trigger to happen. And I think every card we've seen so far is expend 4. I wouldn't be surprised if there's like a rare or a mythic with like expend 8 or something. But it seems like most of them are expend 4. And it's mostly the red-green mechanic, which is fitting. I think it's an interesting way to do the whole like red-green likes to spend a bunch of mana on things thing. Because sort of adding this trigger to all of your more expensive spells makes them a lot better, obviously. Like, if you have to play something that costs 6, that would normally be a little bit of a liability. The fact that you basically add this as an ETB ability, except it's even better because it'll trigger even if they counter it or whatever, that makes a big difference, especially because, the vigilance can mean your creatures can attack and block, at least the Brambleguard Veteran will, and your other raccoons too. So Expend is the red-green mechanic largely, and it's a cool, interesting way to do the whole red-green likes expensive things deal that we haven't exactly seen before. And our last mechanic that's like entirely new is Forage. It is a new graveyard/food mechanic. It's sort of a modal bonus that you can do with certain cards. So Corpseberry Cultivator here says at the beginning of your turn you can forage, and to forage you either exile 3 cards from your graveyard or sacrifice a food. So black-green, especially in this set, is into this mechanic. It's usually into the graveyard. It's often into food too, and they kind of threw it together here, which makes perfect sense for squirrels, which is, the big creature type for the black-green color pair. And there are a lot of cards that give you bonuses when you forage, including the Cultivator itself, which gains a counter. I like the modality here. It means you're going to be able to trigger this more often than you would otherwise be able to. It also makes it seem kind of like you could go in a couple of different directions, potentially, in a deck that's into foraging. Like, You don't necessarily have to have food if you're really good at loading your graveyard, and you don't necessarily need to load your graveyard if you have a bunch of cards that give you food, right? Usually you're probably going to have a mix, and you'll be able to trigger things that forage pretty often, because especially the black-green color pair is all about making that happen. And then the last new mechanic of sorts is just like a new way to do modal spells. It's sort of cutesy and Bloomburrow-y. You can see it on Seasons of Weaving, where each of these modes has paw prints next to it. And then it says, choose up to 5 paw prints worth of modes. You may choose the same mode more than once. There is reason to do this, I guess. Putting different values associated with each of these modes does matter. And it does make for interesting designs, but it is kind of goofy to me. But I do like that when you cast something like Season of Weaving, you have someone will do the math, but you have a lot of different options. You can just draw 5 cards. Sometimes that's what you're going to want to do. You can make 2 token copies of things you've got and then draw a card. Probably the option you'll choose the most. But you can also bounce everything, all non-land, non-token permanents, and make a token copy of one of your things that won't get bounced. That'll be pretty powerful on boards where you're behind, right? So, this is a really strong card. Probably a bomb because, it has this mode that pulls you way ahead if you're at parity when you make 2 tokens and draw a card. And it has this mode where even if you're behind, you bounce everything and hold on to a token copy of something in play. So it's a really good card, and the whole paw print thing is the only sort of new thing here. There are values assigned to each of the modes effectively here that gives you a bunch of different options as to what you can pull off. All right, so those are the the new mechanics. There are 2 returning ones. One of them, which was a pretty big surprise to me, is Threshold. This is an effect that you get some sort of bonus if there are 7 or more cards in your graveyard. Doesn't matter what types they are or mana values or any of that like we've seen recently. It's just the raw number of cards in your graveyard. This is like the original one of these threshold mechanics, which is often what we call them. It was really strong when we last saw it if you were good at loading your graveyard. It seems like mostly in this set they avoided making cards just have way better stats or better into the battlefield abilities when you have Threshold, and most of them just give you some sort of bonus when X happens if you have Threshold, which is a safer space to occupy, and that's what Shoreline Looter does here. It's this unblockable creature that loots every time you hit your opponent, which, first of all, helps you get to Threshold, but then once you get there, you don't have to discard anymore. You just draw a card straight up. So this is the mechanic most of all for blue-black, and obviously you can see some overlap between what black-green's doing as well, because it's also into the graveyard, but also food, whereas blue-black is more into the graveyard purely. So Threshold is a returning mechanic, and we also have class cards returning. A class is an enchantment subtype, and they all have a base effect, like in the case of Hunter's Talent. When it enters, target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control. So, it's a good green removal spell, like we see all the time. And then you have these other modes that you can level it up to. If you pay 1 generic and a green, it's level 2 for as long as it stays in play, and you have this effect for as long as it sticks around, as well as that first effect. Well, in this case, that doesn't make sense because it's an Enter the Battlefield ability, but some of them have static effects, and you get all of the effects. And in this case, when you attack, target attacking creature gets +1/+0 against trample until end of turn. It's a pretty nice bonus. And then you can pay 3 generic and a green, usually probably by the later stage of the game when you have nothing else to do. And at that point, it starts drawing you a card if you have a big enough creature, and obviously level 2 helps you get there. This one is really good because it's like a good removal spell up front, and then it has all this extra value. Some of them are less good. The ones that do stone nothing, like the turn they come down, don't tend to be good. We've seen that in the past. Or the ones that are like super specific synergy that isn't related to the set don't tend to be good. But we've seen some good classes before. They can sort of feel like sagas in that they generate value, as the game goes on and stuff like that. And this one is really good. And yeah, so we have this enchantment subtype. I think there's a cycle of uncommons and a cycle of rares, so it's not like a massive feature of the set, but it's there. All right, let's dive in now with a look at each of the archetypes. And so, going into this set, I think we all thought it was going to be like super heavy into typal stuff, to creature types of a certain type and so forth. And that's there, but it's more like a sub-theme in each of the color pairs than it is the main thing. Like there's a mechanical thing that is the central aspect of each of these color pairs, and then there is a creature type sub-theme within each color pair. So let's go ahead and dive into each of these color pairs, starting with black-white. So this is the Bat color pair, but the thing it's most interested in is life gain. We've seen the main signpost uncommon for black-white. It looks like each color has one signpost uncommon and then a hybrid colored common. So that seems to be the new model, that we get like a signpost common and uncommon, which does tend to result in more synergistic decks. But the signpost uncommon for black-white in this case, which means this is a card that's both of those colors and tells you what synergistically you should be doing in the color pair. You get Starseer Mentor, which I think looks really strong. 5 mana, 3/5 flying vigilance. And then at the beginning of your end step, if you gained or lost life this turn, target opponent loses 3 life unless they sack a non-land permanent or discard a card. That's a pretty real trigger. I will say this card is sort of unique, at least from what we've seen so far. Most of the cards don't care if you've lost life. They just care if you've gained life in black-white. But this one covers both bases. If you lose life by paying it for X effect during a turn, or if you gain life in a turn, which you can do with food, so you can see how black sort of overlaps here. But there are also a lot of other cards in the set that gain you life. And you only have to gain 1 life here, and then you get this pretty legit trigger. It is modal. You know, these kinds of effects can be problematic sometimes because your opponent can choose an option that just doesn't hurt them that much. But if you're triggering this multiple times in a game, they're going to have a harder time making those choices. So I like this card overall, and it looks like a legit life gain as black-white. With, again, there's sort of a bat sub-theme, but it's definitely not the main thing going on in the color pair. Red-white, we've already touched on this, is about that Valiant mechanic, and it's also about mice to a lesser extent. It is kind of cool. All the signpost uncommons in this set, if you're not sure if they're signpost uncommons, they all have Mentor in their name, which is kind of cool. You know, there's these different groups of animals that, I guess, the idea being the signpost uncommon sort of trains that kind of animal in what to do in battle or whatever. And Seedglaive Mentor is our signpost uncommon here. It's got a Valiant trigger of its own, which again means if you target it in any way, you have to do the targeting. But if you target it in any way the first time in a turn, you get something. In this case, you get a counter on Seedglaive Mentor. And it's a 3 mana, 3/2 vigilance haste, so growing a creature like that is pretty sweet. So red-white, it's about being aggressive, targeting your stuff with combat tricks and equip abilities, etc., etc., and just, you know, going off with all that extra value and killing your opponent by making your Valiant creatures better, oftentimes at instant speed. Black-red signpost uncommon is Fireglass Mentor. This one is about lizards, this color pair, but it's also about your opponent losing life. We've seen this as a black-red theme before with Spectacle in one of the Ravnica sets for Rakdos. This is kind of the same thing. I guess Spectacle was more about like alternate casting costs, maybe, now that I'm thinking about it. Whereas this gives you different kinds of effects, like you can see here. At the beginning of your second main phase, if an opponent lost life this turn, you exile the top 2 cards of your library, choose one, until end of turn you can play it. That type of trigger is really strong. We've seen time and time again, it effectively draws you cards. And this is also probably an aggro deck, right? It's something that triggers when you damage your opponent, gives you a bonus if your opponent's been damaged. So, you know, you're going to want to be curving out and damaging your opponent. And there's lots of cards in the set that they've already revealed in black and red that just have random ping effects attached to them that will get things going like this. It is a bit of a bummer. This has such a bad stat line and is kind of hard to get going on its own. Like, your opponent is likely to be able to block and kill it, but it is a really strong trigger, and if it was like even just a 2/2, it'd probably be too good, because it is pretty good at giving you a big advantage. And that's the kind of thing that can really snowball when you're an aggro deck, because it's like, hey, I want to damage them anyway. Oh, look, I have more fuel to damage them more. And it can just really, really get going from there. So that's black-red. It's an aggro deck about lizards and damaging your opponent. In blue-red, we've got spells as the theme. We haven't seen that in a while, shockingly. It used to be what we always saw. This time it is what we're seeing. And Otter is the creature type you care about as sort of a secondary thing. Your signpost here is Stormcatch Mentor, a 2 mana 1/1 with haste and prowess that reduces the cost of your spells. Screaming pretty loud what you want to be doing here, casting lots of cheap spells for an advantage, and that's pretty good. This card worries me a little bit in terms of how good it can actually be as a signpost, because it has such an abysmal starting point as a 2 mana 1/1, and I recently overrated a 1/1 with prowess in Modern Horizons 3, and it was only 1 mana, and it was a 1/1 prowess, and it ended up being pretty problematic. Like, what I mean is, if you've only got 1 toughness to start with, to buff Stormcatch Mentor to be big enough just to attack through other 2-drops, you've got to cast 2 spells. Otherwise, it's just going to trade, and that's not that good of a deal, right? So, I mean, this card has potential. The fact it reduces the cost of your spells is good too, but actually attacking with a 1/1 prowess isn't that good. It's very hard on a lot of boards to successfully get it in and everything. I mean, I don't think it's a bad card, but I am a little bit wary of this Signpost Uncommon, given what we just saw with a 1/1 prowess in another set. To be fair, that set also didn't have a big spell theme, so maybe this will be a little better, but I don't love that just to attack through a 2/2 successfully, you've got to cast 2 spells. All right, so as I'm recording this, we actually don't have the black-green Signpost Uncommon, but we do have the common, which we already saw, that Corpseberry Cultivator. As we've already seen, this is about forage, and it's about squirrels, too. You want to do stuff with the graveyard and stuff with food in this particular color pair. In blue-black, our Signpost Uncommon is Tidecaller Mentor. We've already seen that this one's about rats, and it's about Threshold. This has a pretty nice baseline as a 3-mana 3/3 menace. You can run it out early when you need to and just sort of get in with it. And then later in the game, you get to bounce an on-land permanent if you have Threshold, which is pretty good. I'd like it more if it was both an enabler and a payoff. You know, those tend to be the Signpost Uncommons that really shine. But it may be that if this like entered and milled 2 on top of everything, it would just be too good. I have a feeling, I think for a lot of them, at the early stages of design, they probably do push them so that they're enablers and payoffs, and you know they have to shave things off to keep them from being too good. But yeah, it's still it's a pretty good card. Blue-black is going to be the deck that's most interested in loading the graveyard in the format, and getting Threshold should be doable, but I wouldn't really count on having it on turn 3 very often, and you know that's another interesting point of tension on Tidecaller Mentor. In red-green, we've got Wandertail Mentor as our signpost. This is the color pair about raccoons and that expend mechanic. And this is one that is an enabler and a payoff, because when you expend 4, it gets a counter, and it also gives you mana, which makes it, you know, easier for you to expend. You can do it on turn 3 if you play this on 2 and then drop a 4-drop on turn 3. That's already a pretty powerful start, but then you also have this turn into a 3/3. I like the looks of that pretty well. You know, it reminds me of Tunnel Tipster. It's better in most ways, which it should be because it's multicolored, but it reminds me a lot of that card, and that card was really good, and this is, you know, a multicolored version of it that has, like, way more upside. Next up, we've got blue-white, which is the bird deck, but more than that, it's about flying, except it's also not. This worries me a little bit. You can look on Plume-Creed Mentor here. When it or another creature you control with flying enters, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control without flying. That's weird. It wants you to have flyers, but also not have flyers, and that kind of tension worries me in terms of like the design of a color pair. Usually, the big benefit of being a blue-white skies deck is that you're like, hey, you can't block any of my stuff. I just keep tapping or bouncing your only things that could block my things and attacking in the air. Here, you're also buffing things that are on the ground. And most of the payoffs in the set are like this. They don't do something unless you have both a flyer and not a flyer. And that worries me a little bit, especially because, you know, I like birds and I like blue-white in a lot of formats. I liked it a lot in Modern Horizons 3, where it was like a legit skies deck, whereas this is, it worries me. You know, all blue-white decks, it's not like you ever draft a deck in Limited where literally every card, well, I shouldn't say never. You rarely draft a deck in Limited where all of your cards have flying, right? But you do end up with like 10 flyers and 5 non-flyers often enough that it seems a little bit awkward to me overall. You know, this has a good baseline, and if you can get a counter, like this does have a huge ceiling if you can make your deck have the right mix, because this counts itself. So if this is a 3-mana 2/3 flyer that puts a counter somewhere, that's like a great card. The question is, how often does it actually do it? And that's what worries me. Then in blue-green, we've got Lily Splash Mentor. This is a color pair, an interesting take on blue-green, because it's a blink deck. Normally you see that in blue-white, not here. We see it in blue-green. You can see the Mentor here is a 4-mana 4/4 reach, and it has this ability that lets you exile another creature and then return it to the battlefield, and it comes back with a counter. Activate only as a sorcery. So there are a lot of really good enter the battlefield abilities in blue-green, mostly on frogs. So blinking them is going to give you a lot of value. There's a couple things I don't love about this particular card's activated ability, though. One of them is it's incredibly vulnerable. And not just because, you know, maybe it would be too good if you could use it to dodge removal just by leaving 3 mana up. I'm kind of skeptical it would be too good, because leaving up 3 mana in this day and age is like a big setback. It can be. And it's often not worth doing just to protect a creature and blink it or whatever. But the problem with the activate only as a sorcery part most of all is that you can activate this, target your creature, and your opponent can kill it. And that's gonna happen a lot, I think. The good news is it has this good baseline, and then when you get to a point where you're really in a groove, yeah, this can generate a lot of value by blinking things, making them bigger, giving you, ETB abilities that draw you cards, or put counters on things, or stun things, so on and so forth. But that activated ability is something to temper your expectations of, because the amount that it costs and the restrictions on when you can use it make it kind of dangerous in a lot of situations. And then last up, we've got green-white. This is another one where we've only got the Signpost Common, the one that has the hybrid costed one, but it's pretty clear this color pair is about rabbits, and it's about going wide, and that's what Head of the Homestead tells you. It's a 5-mana 3/2 that generates 2 1/1s, which is a pretty good deal. It's not like insane, but it's the kind of card that you can cast almost no matter when, and it's very difficult for you to die in the next turn, even if you're behind. And if you're ahead, it's going to pull you ahead, which is pretty sweet on a common, I think. So yeah, that's what green-white's about. It's the deck most about going wide. So those are all of the mechanics and what each of the color pairs wants to do in this limited format. Looks pretty exciting to me. There's enough interesting, innovative things going on. I think Gift maybe is the thing I'm most interested in playing with. But all of these archetypes look pretty interesting too. It would have been kind of boring if every color pair was super duper into a typal theme, and then just giving it to one would have made everyone else feel left out. So I think maybe they did the right thing, where the main thing is actually mechanical, but then you have, especially at higher rarities, a few cards that pay off for having creatures of the right type or whatever. So next week there will not be an edition of Needs and Notes, but that's because I'll be doing the whole set review for this format, covering every single card in the set and giving my thoughts on it. Again, if you want to gain access to a spreadsheet with all of my grades when the set review's over, and my ongoing notes as more and more cards are previewed for this set, you can do so by becoming a channel member or a patron. You can find ways to do those things in the description. Thanks for watching.